Welcome back to Counting the Costs. 2 years ago this month, economists in certain sectors started to warn of a financial crisis to come. In the first of a series of interviews with those who predicted the downturn, Sam El-Shahad goes to the Financial Times London headquarters to talk to a woman with her eye on the future.
I'm here at the Financial Times with its assistant editor, GILLIAN. Now, GILLIAN was one of the few people in the world who warned us all that things were not so great with the banking sector years before the financial crisis happened. Now, GILLIAN, why were you able to do that when many others, in fact, thought that things never looked better for the world's financial districts?
Well, I think the key thing was that 3 or 4 years ago, the only people who were actually looking at how the credit markets worked were people who were actually working in the credit markets. There were almost no independent observers who were trying to make sense of what was going on inside the bowels of the City of London or Wall Street. And that's partly because the City of London was not trained to look at economic and financial activity in a holistic way. It's also because far too many parts of the media were taking a very lazy line and just looking at the parts of the city and the parts of Wall Street the bankers wanted them to write about. They weren't really delving down into the vast, subterranean, massive activity that was happening in the credit and derivatives world. On top of that, you had politicians who were even more lazy and saying, great, we're getting this wonderful credit bubble, we're getting cheap mortgages for our consumers, we're getting cheap loans for our companies, but no one was really asking why credit was so cheap. So that all conspired to create a situation where people just weren't looking to see how the system worked.
Do you think the power of banks has been weakened or has it been strengthened by this crisis?
I think, frankly, it's far too early to tell yet whether or not the banks have been seriously weakened by this crisis. We are at the beginning of a very long-running war, to put it crudely. On the one hand, we have some politicians who want to curb the powers of the banks. We also have an electorate that is potentially very angry. On the other hand, we have bankers who are pretty powerful and are hanging on to the power. And that fight between the bankers and some of the anti-bankers, if you like, is being played out in all kinds of legislative areas right now, many of which are pretty complex and technical, but actually will end up being pretty crucial.
Do you think that governments were wrong in sending out a message to these banks that there will always be bailed out? I mean, now we've created these too big to fail banks, and they know that governments will always step in and ultimately bail them out.
There is certainly tremendous moral hazard in the system now, and arguably more moral hazard than there was 2 or 3 years ago. I mean, in some ways, the fundamental situation of the financial sector is even less sustainable than it was 2 or 3 years ago, and even more distorted, and that's very dangerous. The real problem, though, gripping the Western governments is that they don't have a mechanism in place to ensure that if a big bank is insolvent and needs to be closed down quickly, it can be closed down without poisoning the rest of the system or creating a financial panic. What is desperately needed right now is a resolution mechanism, a bankruptcy resolution mechanism for big banks. And what's needed even more badly than a national resolution mechanism is an international agreement that when big banks straddle borders, they can be removed from the system. However, the problem is that efforts to create that international mechanism are moving very, very slowly.
Do you think that we've slaughtered this ideology of market fundamentalism, that financial markets should always be deregulated? Do you think the crisis now will allow us to finally put an end to that ideology?
Essentially what's happened is that the old intellectual framework that has dominated America for the last 3 decades, this was a framework that said that free market capitalism was good, that globalization was usually good, that innovation was always good, that deregulation was good. I think that framework has been seriously questioned by many people as a result of the crisis. There has been a big intellectual breakpoint. The problem is, though, it's not yet clear what is going to replace it. Much, though, now depends on what happens next in the economy. If we go through another crunch, if we see more financial pressures building in the system, if the American public begins to wake up and realise the scale of the debt burden, I think there'll be even more questioning and even more pressure for an alternative vision.
What kind of radical reform of the banking sector would you like to see?
Personally speaking, I think that the events of the last 2 or 3 years, if not the last decade, have shown that extreme deregulation mantras simply don't work. You cannot trust bankers to act rationally in a sort of guard their self-interest, if you like, in a way that's actually going to create a stable system overall. So that's certainly one set of reforms I'd like to see. I'd like to see more curbs on innovation. I'd like to see more questioning of some of the innovation. I think certainly the banks need to be broken up, and there needs to be much more attention paid to the question of whether it's right to have the bankers operating in a little kind of private planet of their own, which no one else is watching or understanding, or not.
Now, it's probably a bit early to say the economic crisis is over, but Japan's economy is officially out of recession. It joins 4 of the world's other top economies that have slowly turned a corner. The US, the world's biggest economy, is still in recession, though. In the second quarter, the economy contracted 1%. Rising star Brazil, South America's biggest economy, slipped into recession in the first quarter, but is expected to make a quick recovery. In the European Union, Germany and France have bounced back. The UK and Italy have not, while Russia continues to slip deeper and deeper into the red. The 2 Asian giants, India and China, are both growing at healthy rates, but remember, they were never actually in recession. And finally, Japan, the second biggest economy in the world. Its economy grew by almost 4% this quarter, which suggests it's on the mend. Now, one industry is weathering the storm in the US, alcohol. Sales have remained steady and breweries are even seeking out new markets abroad. Al Jazeera's Monica VILLAMIZAR traveled to the US state of Tennessee, where she found a thriving homegrown whiskey industry.
For 30 years, Bruce NOVAK worked in the car industry in Detroit. But when he moved south to Tennessee, he found work in a less risky industry.
The whiskey industry is great. When things are bad, people drink to forget. When things are good, we drink to celebrate.
At the Jack Daniel's distillery, he explains the process by which bourbon whiskey turns into Tennessee whiskey.
Every drop of whiskey is made in this room.
Yes, ma'am.
He says the company that employs him has not seen a drop in sales, despite finding itself in the worst U.S. recession in more than a generation.
Bourbon whiskey is not only an iconic American product, but it's also a foundation for this regional economy. For instance, this distillery pays more taxes to the state of Tennessee than any other company.
Ironically, the distillery is located in a town where it's forbidden by law to buy or sell alcohol. But this doesn't stop locals from drinking.
We can go out and buy it and bring it home and drink it, and most of us do.
A poll carried out 2 months ago found that 64% of Americans drink alcohol. That's a comparable figure to statistics from before the recession. Daniel Ryan, a musician turned bartender who works in Nashville, has his own theory to explain this trend.
It's ridiculous how much money actually still comes over the bar. I think that the more people start feeling bad about the economy or how bad their other problems are, they want to escape their problems, so they come to the bar to drink and have a good time and try to forget about their problems.
But some who work in Tennessee's other great industry, country music, say drinking alcohol has nothing to do with drowning sorrows.
People want to feel good about themselves because when they go to work, they might not necessarily know that their job's going to be there.
But Americans generally band together and become a stronger community when times get hard. History shows it time and time again.
Monica VILLAMIZAR, Al Jazeera, Nashville.
A reminder that you can keep up to date with these and other stories on our website, aljazeera.net/English. Click on the left-hand side for the business page. And that's it from me, Mariam Namazi, this week on Counting the Cost. Thanks for watching.